Over a year ago, I did a video about trying to power my 12-volt fridge for camping using a small, cheap portable power station. That video has over 400 comments to date, many of them telling me how I did it all wrong. This is the internet after all, but they were at least partly correct. So in this video, I build my own much better solution. Stick around so you can tell me what I'm doing wrong this time, or maybe you'll pick up a useful idea or two. Hi, I'm Gary, a retired electrical engineer who makes videos about consumer technology stuff that happens to interest me. If you're watching this video, you may well have seen this first one I made last year, where I tried to power my 12-volt fridge for overnight camping using one of several small and cheap portable power stations. It didn't go well, partly because I didn't get enough sun for solar recharging, but mostly because the power station simply didn't have enough energy storage. That video resulted in several hundred people telling me either how they did it right or how I did it wrong. I do appreciate all that feedback, and in fairness, only a few actually said I was an idiot. A lot of people criticized me for not buying a big-name power station like Bluetti or Jackery. I commend them for brand loyalty, but they sort of missed the point. I was trying to do this as cheaply as possible, not as reliably as possible, and as it turned out, my failure really had nothing to do with brands. The other criticism that was absolutely on target, however, is that my power stations were just not big enough. In case you missed them, I did 2 follow-on videos testing the energy consumption of my fridge, including a wide range of temperatures, and sure enough, it was unlikely that I could keep the fridge running for a 2-day, 1-night camping trip without a lot of sunshine. 300 watt-hours or so is just not enough energy for the job. I let the whole thing drop for months and went back to using an ice chest for camping because the fridge was a luxury I can easily do without. But then I came across something that caused me to rethink. Most of the useful suggestions on the video fell into one of 2 categories: either buy a much bigger power station or just buy a big 12-volt battery and hook the fridge directly to it. Neither of those choices really appealed to me, the first because of cost, and the second because I didn't want a permanently wired battery in the back of my car, and there wasn't room for a second one under the hood. But then I saw an ad for a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery for the ridiculously low price of $134, and a light bulb went off in my head. I could build my own portable power station with a big lithium battery and still do it cheaply. So that's what this video is about, the design and construction of a do-it-yourself portable power station. And yes, I do know there are already YouTube videos of people doing this. So why am I making another one? First off, I'm doing this for me, not for YouTube, but why not document it along the way? Second, the description of designing and building it will hopefully have some useful tips for someone who's looking to do this affordably. That's important to me, and I'm guessing to lots of other people as well. And third, mine should have at least a couple of unique aspects that might get you thinking, whether you like them or hate them. So let's get right into it. The design phase, if you want to call it that, really just consists of deciding what functions you want it to do. Then you can choose the appropriate components to do those things, although in my case I already had a few parts I thought would work. The number one question, of course, is the battery. What kind and how big should it be? Lithium iron phosphate is the obvious choice because of its combination of energy density and safety. This CyclenBat battery I bought on sale from Amazon had good reviews, and it happened to be a mini size, even smaller than the Group 24 one I used for my pop-up camper upgrade. It's rated for 1,280 watt-hours, which is 3 to 4 times the capacity of the power stations I own now. Since its performance is really key to this whole project, I ran a few cycles on it before jumping into this any further. I charged it using 3 different lithium battery chargers, and it produced 101 or 102 amp hours every time at a 10 amp discharge rate. So that seemed good to go. For my needs, it has to power some specific devices, and of course it needs to be able to be recharged. So here's my list of required inputs and outputs. Yours will be different, but most of these are actually fairly typical. For charging, it needs to accept solar power from one of my portable, nominally 12-volt solar panels, and it needs to support 120-volt AC recharging before a trip, or maybe in a campground that has power. Things it needs to power: my 12-volt iSeco refrigerator, which uses 40 watts or less when running in eco mode, a little 12-volt water pump with a 5.5 by 2.1 millimeter plug, very low power, USB power for my portable fan, USB-C power for charging my phone and my navigation tablet, and power from my travel laptop, which has a 45-watt AC adapter, or it can use USB-C power. That's pretty much all of it. Voltage monitoring would be nice to have, and current and power monitoring would be a real luxury. But in my particular case, given enough energy storage, I'm okay living without them. Here's a simple block diagram of what the completed system is supposed to look like. If you watched my last video, you'll be glad to know there are no circuit diagrams in this one. I got a little carried away there. As a totally irrelevant aside, I asked Microsoft Copilot to generate this simple diagram for me, and this is what it came up with. I asked it to simplify that, and I got this. Apparently, AI doesn't know simple yet. As you can see, actually performing all these functions takes more than just a 12-volt battery. It needs a solar charge controller, a battery charger, something to produce USB power, and a DC to AC inverter. And of course a bunch of receptacles, connectors, and wiring to tie it all together. So let me briefly run through the components I selected. This Litime solar charge controller was left over from an earlier project. It cost me only $25, and it has a monitor panel that shows battery and solar panel voltage and incoming power. It's a PWM controller instead of a more efficient MPPT one, but the gain in efficiency wasn't worth spending a lot more money for my smallish solar panels. This $30 lithium battery charger from Amazon only delivers 5 amps of charging current, so it takes 20 hours to recharge a fully discharged 100 amp hour battery. But it works fine with this battery, and its size and shape make it perfect for this project, as you will see. At worst, it'll have to be plugged in for a day before a trip, and in practice, I doubt the battery will ever be fully discharged. In fact, if that happens and the battery shuts down, this charger won't restart it, so I'll need to avoid that. This $20 Walmart inverter has been kicking around in my car for several years, and again, its size and shape are ideal for my use. It's only rated for 120 watts output, which is way less than most power stations. But I don't go camping with anything that requires even that much AC power. I did test it up to 100 watts or so, and its voltage output held up okay. This combined 12-volt and USB power panel was also left over from another project. But it's only $15 from Amazon, and it's what I would have bought for the purpose anyway. It has USB-A and USB-C power delivery outlets, a voltmeter, and an on-off switch. Hard to beat that for the price and convenience. But I didn't want to power the fridge from a mostly plastic receptacle because the spring in the plug tends to push it out of the socket. So I added this $7 all-metal 12-volt socket specifically for the fridge. And these 5.5 by 2.1 millimeter power sockets cost about $1.25 a piece from AliExpress. That takes care of all the power to the various devices. I decided to use these terminal bus bars for wiring connections because some of the wires involved are as large as 10 or 12 gauge, and it's nice to be able to really tighten them down. Oh, one more thing. I've been using Anderson PowerPole type connectors for lots of things, and I really like them because they're foolproof and you can connect the 15, 30, and 45 amp versions interchangeably. My portable solar panels and my solar extension cable have been adapted to them. So my original plan was to have one of them just hanging from the charge controller because the panel mounts for them are way overpriced. However, I found this 3D printed one on eBay for only $3, which makes for a neater installation. That takes care of all the components. Obviously, if you were doing this yourself, you could pick and choose whatever works for your needs. That's the real beauty of building your own. You aren't paying for any features you don't need, and you can go as cheap or as luxurious as you want. Next comes packaging. I certainly didn't want this pile of parts and wiring loose in my car or stuffed in a cardboard box, so what to put it in? The logical and cheapest choice for me turned out to be this battery box. It's a Group 31 size, which is way bigger than my mini battery, and it seemed to have enough extra room to hold all this stuff. Recognize that if you're building this yourself, the packaging won't be as compact as a commercial unit. That brings us to the layout and assembly part of the project. The battery box comes with a divider, apparently intended to keep a shorter battery like a Group 24 from sliding around. But it still leaves a lot of space around my mini-size battery, so a spacer of some sort seemed called for. Wood is non-conductive, easy to work with, and cheap, so a couple pieces from the scrap pile in my workshop got screwed together to hold the battery in place. I decided to put most of the receptacles and controls on the lid of the box and just run a cable down to the battery in the bottom. There was room above the battery to house the charge controller, so I marked out a rectangle on the lid to cut out for mounting it. The battery box is not the hard kind of plastic that shatters easily, so it seemed a utility knife should be able to make the cutout. But after 5 minutes of struggling with very little to show for it, I gave up and resorted to a vibratory saw, which did the job in under 2 minutes. Took a bit of rasping, sanding, and retrimming to clean up the cut, but the eventual result looks reasonably finished. Mounting the rest of the components on the lid was easy because they all fit in circular holes. I used a drill press, although you could certainly do this easily with a portable drill. The plastic box is soft enough to drill without cracking, but hard enough not to clog up the bits too badly. The combo 12-volt and USB panel is actually a cover plate for 2 cylinders that fit in 1 1/8" holes. I didn't have an 1 1/8" hole saw, so I used a 1-inch one and then enlarged the hole with a Forstner bit. I also accidentally drilled one of the holes a bit off-center, and a Forstner bit happens to be one of the few drill bits that can easily move a hole just a little. Once the holes are drilled, mounting the assembly is a piece of cake. You just poke it through the 2 holes, put the plastic nuts on the back, then line up the faces with the rubber covers on the front. Tighten it up, and you're all done. Mounting the power pole connector, the 5521 socket, and the switch for the inverter are all basically the same. Drill the appropriate size hole for each one. They're all different, of course, and then put them in the holes. The power pole mount doesn't have a retaining nut, so it had to be bolted to the lid. But otherwise, that's all there is to it. It made sense to me to mount the 12-volt metal socket for the fridge on the bottom half of the case, since that's where the other higher current components are mounted. And it doesn't have a cover, so this keeps stuff from falling into it. But it's the same process. Drill a hole in the chosen spot, put the socket in the hole, and screw the metal retaining shell on it. It fit perfectly in between the locations I picked for the charger and the inverter. As an aside, I cut off the cables that came on these and put in Anderson connectors, in case I ever wanted to reuse them elsewhere. They both fit nicely in the end of the battery box. A larger or longer charger would not have worked. As it was, I simply stuffed it in the space because its mounting holes were pretty much unusable. For the inverter, I put a couple machine screws through its back plate so it could be bolted to the inside of the box. This location has the disadvantage that the lid has to be removed to plug something into it, but I'd probably have to do that anyway to let the hot air out. Both the inverter and the charger are quite hot when running. I don't honestly ever expect to use the inverter. I can power my laptop from this USB-C car charger that can plug into either the power stations or one of the 3 sockets in the car. The terminal bus bars fit conveniently on the wooden spacer next to the battery, close to everything that needed to connect to them, and I drilled a bunch of holes in the divider plate to make it easy to get wires to the terminals. At this point, the whole assembly was ready to be wired up. I'll spare you the boring details of the wiring, which took several hours and was tedious, but not at all complicated. The only real setback in wiring the lid came when I was about to connect all the 12-volt wires together to run to the lower half of the box. It became obvious that putting several 10 or 12 gauge wires plus an 18 gauge one in a crimp connector was a bad idea. So I changed my strategy and mounted 2 more terminal bus bars on the lid, which made all those connections much easier. Checking the continuity and polarity of all this using a bench power supply gave me at least some confidence that it was wired correctly, and the wiring in the bottom half of the box was even simpler. It was basically just 2 wires each, coming from the battery, the charger, and the 12-volt receptacle to the terminal strips, along with the inverter and 3 wires from the lid. The inverter switch is mounted on the lid, so it has a switch 12-volt line as well. The battery fuse is mounted directly to the positive battery terminal, and it didn't go in until the very last step to avoid accidental shorts during the wiring process. I have been known to drop things. Then I could close up the box, see it come to life, and try the switches. Everything lit up as expected. No fire, smoke, or explosions, and hooking an actual 60-watt load to the inverter also worked. It is a whiny little fan, so I'm glad I won't be using it much. Here's the finished result, both inside and outside. The wiring's not terribly neat, but it's simple enough to follow without a circuit diagram. And once the lid is on, I think it actually looks pretty good. That brings us to the moment of truth. Will it do what my undersized power stations would not, and power my 12-volt fridge reliably for a couple of days camping trip? It certainly should, but I'm a test engineer by profession, so I wanted some hard data. I set it up to do as realistic a test as can reasonably be managed in Idaho in the wintertime. We keep our house at 70 degrees this time of year, so I set the fridge at 16 degrees, which is quite a bit colder than I normally do, to make it work a bit harder. It had more than a gallon of water and several containers in the main compartment, along with 4 water bottles in what I call the vegetable tray. After cooling the fridge down for 24 hours on AC power, I connected it to the power station and ran it in eco mode, starting with a fully charged battery. That's what I would do for an actual trip. I swapped the 4 water bottles out for room temperature ones every several hours during the day, to mimic the effect of taking food in and out. As you can see, the fridge uses about 32 watts when the compressor is running in eco mode. But it only runs intermittently, so its average energy use under these conditions is something under 15 watts. That gives a predicted runtime of more than 80 hours with no other loads on a fully charged battery. Did it do it? Oh, yes, it did. It ran for 85 3/4 hours, which is over 3.5 days, before the fridge shut off on under voltage. I accidentally left the setting on high. When I restarted it with the fridge under voltage setting on low, it ran for another half hour before the battery shut off, at which point it had delivered 100 amp hours and 1,300 watt hours of energy. So that should meet my performance goal for a 1 or 2 night camping trip, even without any solar recharging. It still leaves the question of cost. You remember my other goal was for this to be cheap. This breakdown shows that the total cost of the finished package was about $260, including what I originally paid for the items that I already had lying around. That means this system cost about 20 cents per watt hour, which is much cheaper than a commercially built power station. But of course it doesn't do everything they do either. A pre-built unit with a battery this big would typically have at least a 1,000-watt inverter, an MPPT solar charge controller, much faster AC charging ability, and more bells and whistles. One of mine even has Bluetooth, for example. But here's the thing. I don't need any of those features. Your needs are probably different, and I certainly wouldn't claim this is the best approach for anyone else. But it works for me, and if you're a do-it-yourselfer, you might consider building your own. It really wasn't hard. That's it for this video. I'm not planning to pursue this topic anymore because I'm satisfied with the outcome, but your comments are always welcome. And please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed it. If you hated it, you know what that other button is for. And thank you very much for watching.